The Hey Charity podcast, amplifying voices, inspiring change. Hey Charity is a podcast where we deep dive into the world of not-for-profits, interviewing visionary charity leaders who are making a real difference.
We're going to look at how good governance shouldn't be perceived negatively by charities and trustees. If done right, it should help you more effectively fulfil your charity's purposes.
Through engaging conversations, we explore the challenges charities face, the successes they celebrate, and how understanding the law can empower them to do even more good. Whether you're a charity professional, volunteer, or simply passionate about charity work, this podcast offers practical legal insights and inspiring stories to help charities thrive. Tune in for expert advice and real-world inspiration to fuel your organisation's mission.
I'm Sophie Bartup, Community Development Manager at the Hey Smile Foundation. I've proudly spent 13 years volunteering within my local community and 6 incredible years working within the voluntary and community sector, and I am a hugely passionate advocate promoting volunteering within charities.
I'm Gerry Morrison, and I've been a charity lawyer for over 20 years now, and I specialise in charity law exclusively and helping charities and their trustees navigate the complex minefield of charity law and their relationship with the regulator, the Charity Commission.
And I'm Harriet Wheeldon, Senior Solicitor at Rollits. I've spent over 5 years helping charity trustees navigate the legal landscape and understand their legal duties, and I'm excited to bring that knowledge to the podcast. Throughout the series, we will be joined by colleagues from Rollits who will share their advice on how strong charity leadership and a clear understanding of the law can make a huge difference to a charity's success.
And we're thrilled to co-host the Hey Charity podcast, where we'll be sitting down with inspiring charity leaders who will share their stories and give you the tools and legal insights to help your charity thrive. So whether you're running a charity or are just passionate about making a difference, join us on this journey to empower charities to succeed. And now, let's go to today's episode.
The legal discussion featured on the podcast is for general guidance only. It provides useful information in a concise form. Action should not be taken without obtaining specific legal advice.
Part 1 of our Trustees podcast episode will feature Gerry and Harriet from Rollits discussing the legal duties of charity trustees and what this means in practice.
Thanks, Sophie. In terms of trustees' key legal duties, it sounds incredibly dull, I think. But what we're trying to do with this is make these duties come alive in a way that will hopefully help trustees to enjoy their role more, to hold more effective meetings, and to have better decision making, because what we find with charities is that where they make a huge impact is where they can be really innovative and make really interesting solutions to complex social problems. And in order to be innovative, you need to know what your key legal duties are so that you can effectively discharge them and have really engaging and interesting trustees meeting and that open debate and discussion. Because a key part of being a trustee is the contribution that trustees make as volunteers. So I think if we're looking at the key main duties, I think, Harriet, if we look at those and actually what they are and how they're applied in practice.
Yeah, I think going through each duty one by one would be quite interesting for people to really understand what they mean. So there's 6 main duties, and the first is acting within the best interests of the charity. Well, what does that mean? Acting in the best interests of the charity means putting aside any personal interests and putting the charity first, even though if a decision would be better for you personally, it's all about the charity. And the best way to look at this is through avoiding conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest we both see in practice, and they are the areas where people trip up the most. Not because anyone is intentionally doing anything to, personally benefit, but through a misunderstanding of what conflicts of interest actually are, because it can be quite confusing for people. For example, conflicts can be conflicts of loyalty, so a loyalty to another organisation, so perhaps another charity where you're involved, or maybe a commercial organisation, maybe it's your employer. But more obvious examples are financial conflicts. So it's all about being aware of when a conflict arises and how to manage that.
I think that's where trustee conflict of interest policies can be really useful, especially if you have someone joining your board or your team who's never been a trustee before, because the key duty to put aside conflicts of interest and act in the charity's best interest, it sounds very obvious, but it's how you apply it in practice, as you said, Harriet, where charities inadvertently can get tripped up. And so having a clear conflicts of interest policy, if I have a conflict of interest, what do I do? A good policy will make it clear that you should declare that at the outset of the meeting. And this is where a good meeting agenda can really help with the papers that you circulate before the trustees meeting, and having the declaration of any conflicts of interest in respect of any agenda items be the first item of business. And then the next step is preventing it from impacting on the decision making or being perceived to impact on the decision making, because as we've seen, conflicts of interest with charities, perception is just as important as the reality, and so it's making it clear that you've prevented it impacting the decision making process.
Yeah, the perception point's really important. How does it look to the outside world? What I would say about conflicts is they can seem quite scary, but again, having that conflict of interest policy in place will help people manage conflicts effectively and properly, and then you can get to the real business of the charity and the decision making. Conflicts can be quite upsetting for some people in charities. You go into your charity trustee meeting as a volunteer. You're not going there to promote yourself, you're not going there to put your personal interests forward, and then all of a sudden you get asked to leave the room, you're not allowed to vote on this. It can feel quite personal, and I think having that conflict of interest in place and being provided with that from the moment you become a trustee, understanding that it applies to all trustees and it's a requirement of charity law to manage conflicts of interest, and remembering that managing conflicts of interest is not personal. I think that's really important to remember.
I know, it's the part where you actually have to leave the room that can cause the issues, or that can get forgotten. People know not to vote on a matter that they have a conflict of interest on, but someone's simple presence in the room when the debate and discussion takes place could be perceived, particularly by someone who doesn't know the trustees, doesn't know the person themselves, to have had impacted on that process. So the part we often see people forget is to actually leave the meeting room if it's a physical meeting, or step outside of the online meeting while that debate and discussion takes place, and then to have that noted in the minutes that happened, because it's noting the procedures that you put in place to stop the conflict from impacting the decision making process. It's having the evidence there that you did that and lived by those procedures that's really important to protect trustees. And then the second key duty is accountability. And what does that mean? Well, it's making sure that you as a board of trustees, you're also accountable. Who to? And that's effectively the people who benefit from your charity services. How do you make sure you're accountable, though, as a board? In our experience, there can often be, over time, a disconnect between the trustee board and the charity staff and volunteers, and ultimately the people who benefit from the charity's services. And it's not intentional. It just takes place over time because trustees are volunteers. They may only attend 4 meetings a year, and it's making sure that you remain as a board connected to your end users. So it's thinking creatively around, how do we make sure we're accountable for delivering the charity's mission? How do we know we're giving people what they actually want and need?
Accountability also means accountability to the regulator. So, not the most exciting things, but, making sure you have your filings up to date with the Charity Commission, having the correct financial statements, compliant financial statements and accounts filed. They're really important things. Sometimes there can be late filing. Consistent late filing for these things, it can be a problem, and it can also be the cause for the Charity Commission to open regulatory concern cases and look into the charity a bit more. So we would always recommend making sure all reporting is completed on time, and that's one way to demonstrate and comply with your duty of accountability.
That's really important, and also when it comes to successful fundraising, which is a theme that we look at in a later podcast, because funders will often do due diligence on a charity and look whether its reports and accounts to the Charity Commission are up to date. And if they're not, the Commission puts a big red flag on your charity's register entry, and that's immediately off-putting. If I'm a funder looking as to whether I want to fund this charity, I want to know, are its trustees up to date with their legal duties and responsibilities? Are they abiding by them? And if the reports and accounts aren't in on the Charity Commission on time, then that can cause me concerns. And then the third key legal duty is to always act within the charity's governing document and the law. And you see a lot of this in practice, Harriet, don't you, with what we do, the work we do at Rollits?
Yeah, I think the governing document is a really important document for a charity. What is it to start with? Let's talk about what it is. Well, it might be called the Constitution, it might be known as your Articles of Association, could be rules. It all depends on the legal structure for your charity, but generic term is the governing document, and like Gerry said, there's a duty to act within the law and in accordance with the governing document. The governing document is a living document. It's often forgotten about, which is where trustees run into issues. An example being, you've got a really exciting project, everyone is on board, you've found a great source of funding, everyone's ready and raring to go, but then it all grinds to a halt because you haven't got an appropriate power, the objects aren't up to date, and now we've got to look at the governing document, but everyone wants to just get on with the project. And that's where keeping it up to date, periodic reviews are really useful tools to plan for future planning for charities.
That is really important. And again, going back to fundraising, a funder will often ask to see your governing document or your constitution, and if it isn't up to date, they will pull you up on it, and they may give it as the reason why they can't fund you at that time. So that's another reason to make sure it's properly up to date with a clear statement of your powers as trustees and what the charity's purposes are, which brings us on to the next key legal duty, which is ensuring that your charity is carrying out its purposes for public benefit. Again, it sounds like stating the obvious, but if you don't actually know what your purposes are at law because you've not looked at your governing document for several years, how do you know they're up to date? Because a key legal duty as a trustee is to ensure that you faithfully pursue your charity's mission and that you're advancing that clear statement of your charity's purposes set out in the governing document. And Harriet and I have seen some wonderful, weird examples of very outdated statements of a charity's mission. You've seen one about coal, haven't you?
Delivering coal to the poor on New Year's Eve, I think it was, which is not really fit for purpose anymore. Helping the poor or people who've fallen on hard times is obviously more appropriate. So yes, steps have to be taken to update that.
So important.
What we would say is that all the duties, whilst they can sound onerous, but they're there to help you efficiently run the charity, and they will help you run the charity and come to decisions, enable you to embark on new projects efficiently if you're carrying them out. So when it comes to objects, if they're not up to date, if you've not complied with the duty to review the governing document and carry out the purposes for the charity's mission for the public benefit, then it can cause delays with delivering the charity's mission, because changing the objects is a regulated change that needs a charity commission's consent, and that can take time.
It can take a long time to get the Commission's consent to change your purposes, even for a fairly standard change and something that may seem obvious. Well, we don't deliver coal to the poor on Christmas Eve anymore, or we don't really refer to people as being old spinsters from a particular area of Beverley, just to give an example of things that we have seen from 300 years ago. But it can take a very long time to get Commission consent, which of course can lead to delay. And when we talk about carrying out those purposes for public benefit is what charities are about. They're not about benefiting one person, two people. They're about benefiting the public. And that's why you have the procedures and the duties to comply with managing conflicts of interest, because it's not about trustees' personal benefit, it's public benefit. No one owns a charity. Someone may have founded a charity and put a great deal of their passion and enthusiasm and sometimes time and resource and own money into setting it up, but they don't actually own it because its assets are ring-fenced for public benefit. Once you set a charity up, you can't make it not a charity. You can't take as an individual the assets back out. They are forever in perpetuity ring-fenced for charity, and that's a key principle of charity law.
That's what distinguishes the charitable sector from the private sector. There's no distribution of private profits for the benefit of any individual. It's all ploughed back into the charity. Now, charities can make a surplus, but that will go back towards the charity's purposes and mission.
Absolutely. And then the next key legal duty is managing your charity's resources responsibly. And a key duty of a trustee is to maximise those resources to pursue the charity's purposes for public benefit. Another reason why it's so important to abide by managing conflicts of interest, knowing what your resources are, making the best use of them, ensuring charity property is insured. If you raise funds and you're collecting cash, ensuring that you've got proper internal financial controls and procedures for making sure that gets properly banked, that you have internal systems in place to prevent fraud, because sadly, when you've got charities relying on volunteers and people's goodwill and good faith, and everyone's working together and acting in good faith, you've got to be very careful though, because we do sadly see instances where charities have been the subject to fraud and have been taken advantage of. So it's about being alert to that and just making sure that your procedures ensure that you can discharge that duty to manage your charity's resources responsibly. And then the final one is to act with reasonable care and skill.
Yeah, and that standard is the care and skill of
a prudent person. You have to basically have the same duty of care that you apply to your own personal finances, your own personal situation as you would do to being a trustee.
And if you're a professional trustee, or perhaps you come from a professional background, so perhaps a legal background or an accounting background, you may be held to a higher standard than a lay trustee, because you've got that extra skill, that extra knowledge, which you should use to help the charity, and to, if you've got that accounting background, you should understand the charity's accounts.
And then I think finally, just to touch on it, trustees need to bear in mind that if they delegate any of their duties, it's good to have clear terms of reference for committees. So make sure that any committees acting on the charity's behalf have a clear remit as to what their purpose is, because we've all seen death by committee, and I think Harriet and I still see a lot of where a committee is a complete mirror of the Board of Trustees. And when used effectively, committees can really save time at trustees meetings.
Yeah, they're a really good opportunity to bring in additional skills and experience from people who may not have the time to be a trustee, but they're really passionate about the charity and they want to be involved in some way. Or maybe you've got a particular project that really needs some expertise that perhaps the board don't have at the moment. So they can be brought in to sit on a committee, but like Gerry says, it shouldn't just be a complete mirror of the board, but whilst there should be some accountability and some overlap.
And so finally, just to recap, the 6 main duties of a trustee are: act in your charity's best interest, make sure your charity is accountable. Who is it accountable to? How do you make sure it is doing that? Act within your charity's governing document and the law. Carry out your charity's purposes for public, not private benefit, because that's what distinguishes a charity from the commercial sector. Manage your charity's resources responsibly. And then finally, act with reasonable care and skill. And if you abide by all those principles, it should make for being a trustee. It should make it enjoyable, it should lead for more effective meetings, more decision makings, and crucially being innovative and having that appropriate challenge and oversight, which is what the trustees are there to do, to ask those questions and make sure the charity fulfills its mission.
Being a trustee is about fulfilling legal duties. It's also about taking an active role, participation and contribution, making sure you have the time commitment to being a trustee, or otherwise perhaps sitting on a delegated committee. But altogether as a whole, the duties should really allow for effective decision making and effective governance of the charity.
Welcome to our very first episode, where we bring you the stories, experiences and insights of extraordinary people who have made a lasting impact within their communities. And today, I couldn't be more thrilled to introduce our very first guest. Trish Dalby retired in September 2019 from her role as Deputy Chief Executive at Hull City Council, having worked in Hull and East Riding Councils for more than 30 years, serving at both operational and strategic levels. Trish was also on the board of Esteem, a public-private partnership that delivers infrastructure solutions for the city, including over £450 million of new and improved education, cultural and sports facilities across Hull. Furthermore, Trish represented the council's interests on both the boards of the Deep and Hull Chuck Theatre. In addition to her role as Deputy Lieutenant in the County of the East Riding of Yorkshire, Trish currently volunteers as the Chair of Trustees for Welcome House and the Hey Smile Foundation. Trish is the Chair of Generation Hull, the local cultural education partnership, Vice Chair of Freedom Festival Arts Trust, and a Trustee of the Francis and Cyril Bibby Bequest, a Trustee of the James Reckitt Library Trust, and a Family and Criminal Panel Magistrate. Amongst these exceptional achievements, Trish's most important role is as a hands-on grandma to 2 gorgeous children, Jacob, who is 7, and Ellie, who is 4. Trish's journey has no doubt inspired hundreds of people, including my own. So, without further ado, let's deep dive into our conversation with the inspirational Trish Dalby. So thank you for being here. So we'll deep dive straight into you and your inspirational journey as a charity trustee. So I'm really keen to understand what initially motivated you to take on the role of becoming a charity trustee, and what keeps you committed over such a long period of time.
Well, first of all, I feel very privileged that I'm here on the first podcast. And I suppose if you think about what I did in my previous role, I retired 5 years ago, and I'd always worked in the public sector from from being 29 onwards, and because of the work that I did, I often couldn't become involved in some of the organisations that I wished to become involved with as a volunteer, because there could have been a conflict of interest. And, I was working 12, 13-hour days. That is what I do. I like working hard, so it wasn't a problem. And I had a brilliant job, which I thoroughly enjoyed. But as soon as I decided to retire, that then was a time for me to be able to think about what else I could do to really give whatever skills, whatever abilities, whatever connections I had to be able to help charities to deliver what they wanted to deliver, but then also to make that difference, because making a difference is what matters in the community in which you live. And I had the privilege of working both in Hull and the East Riding, so it seemed logical that I should become involved with charities that I'd already known about as part of my role previously, but as I say, because of potential conflicts of interest, couldn't actually be involved with, and obviously didn't have the time to become involved with. So that was really how it started. Being a trustee is just one of the most rewarding things I've ever done in my life. And I think that's why it's so important that people do become involved in charities, but especially those that are local to them, because you know your community better, so you know how your skills and abilities can actually maximise the benefit that you can bring. But it's just the difference that those charities make, and how hard people work, how hard volunteers work to make that difference. So that's really what's kept me going.
Brilliant, Trish. I'm really, really keen to touch upon, you mentioned around your previous professional career and how you've transitioned into the charity sector as a trustee. Now we at the Hayes Smile Foundation deliver the Trustee Academy, which is working with corporates to understand how individuals that they work with can transfer those skills into the charity sector. So how important is it that businesses are able to support and empower the ambitions of their employees when they wish to retire potentially, or they wish to combine their role with being a charity trustee?
If you think about the companies that we have across Hull and East Yorkshire who do great things, across manufacturing, industry, professional services, the skills that people have who work in those organisations could be really kind of quite critical and actually game-changing for lots of charities. And I know that the majority of people who work in Hull and East Yorkshire want to give something back. So for corporations and companies to be involved in the Trustee Academy is very important. It gives a segue, if you like, a pathway. And also what's important about the Trustee Academy is it's not always plain sailing, and being a trustee does have quite significant responsibility. So for somebody to understand about what that could be and what contribution they could make before they make that leap, if you like, into the world of charities and being a trustee is really important. So I can't think of, and I'm desperately trying to think of one now, but I actually can't think of any company and the people I know who work in the sort of the business sector in Hull and East Yorkshire. I can't think of anyone who isn't already involved in some way in those companies, but it's just they might not be involved. They may be in fundraising, they may be in giving some of their professional services, such as Rollits do a great thing with that. So they're already involved. It's just that next step to enable their employees to understand what it is to be a charity trustee and decide if that's the right role for them, because it might not be for everybody. All trustees are volunteers, but it may be that volunteering in another way is better suited to some people. So it just gives them an additional potential pathway into using their talents and their time to the benefit of their community.
Brilliant. I think you make a really important point there about the pathways as well, Trish. Becoming a charity trustee may be a fantastic pathway for somebody like yourself, but actually there may be other areas somebody can contribute, such as linking in with partners in their corporate volunteering days as well, which is a fantastic example of how you don't have to commit to the long-term charity trustee role, but it may be that you can give 1 or 2 days a year to support, whether that's in digital, whether that's in marketing. As you say, we've got such a plethora of fantastic businesses within our region that can partner with charities to help empower them to do the amazing things. You mentioned there around the Trustee Academy, and you mentioned something around plain sailing and that it's not always plain sailing. So this leads me really well into our next question, which is about the challenges. And I'm really keen to hear from you around some of the biggest challenges you've faced as a charity trustee and how you've navigated them, particularly in your role as chair.
Being a chair is quite different from being on the board of trustees, because you kind of have to be able to step back make sure that everybody is engaged in the conversation, everyone has an opportunity to contribute. Sometimes that's really hard. If you're very passionate about a point and you really want something to happen and you have to persuade the other trustees that's the case, that's not always the role of the chair. The chair has to make sure that everyone can contribute, that the conversation and the discussion is robust and appropriate and respectful, but then an agreement or a way forward is met through consensus, rather than you as the chair pushing your point of view. So I've had to learn to do that.
Yeah. Thanks, Trish. And again, I think that explains the unique difference between a charity trustee and the chair as well, and how important that chair is around that leadership and ensuring that everybody has a voice. So I think that's really, really important.
Can I say, well, the other challenges that I think being a trustee is actually understanding the organisation within which you're working. I'm involved in a number of charities across Hull and East Yorkshire, and they're all very different. They're at different stages of maturity. So for some charities, there's one in particular that I'm involved with, which is still relatively new. So we've had quite different challenges. We're kind of designing the bike as we're riding it, so to speak, whereas other charities are well established, have all the infrastructure in place, and actually understanding the benefit that you can bring to that organisation, whether it be in terms of you roll your sleeves up and you get on and you do things, or because a charity is very new and it needs that intense and focused support of its trustees, or you actually have a more or a less transactional role, where actually you are providing only that strategic direction, and understanding the difference between being a trustee and the role of the board to actually being the executive, the doers of an organisation is really important too. And that's sometimes, that's why you have to understand and know the charity, because your role will be different in whichever organisation of which you become a trustee.
I really like that message, and I think that's one we kind of echo through the Trustee Academy process as well. What are you passionate about? Where do you feel you can help a difference? And we always try and give some top tips to people thinking about becoming a charity trustee, whether that's visiting the organisation, speaking to the chief executive, if it's a smaller volunteer-led, can you shadow a volunteer for the day? Now, you've got extensive experience of being a charity trustee, and as you've alluded to, Trish, there's lots of differences between charities. Before we move on to Harriet, I know she's really keen to talk to you about the roles and responsibilities. What advice would you give to anybody that's thinking about becoming a trustee? So before they attend their first board meeting, what would you describe as the best practice journey for a charity trustee thinking about becoming a board member?
First and foremost, you've got to follow your passion. So if it's a particular area of activity or an area of support, really it's got to be something you're emotionally invested in, but emotion isn't enough, and I think that's one of the most important things. Having sympathy and really feeling the need is very important, but actually sympathy without action is pointless, and I think that's very important. Passion is critical, but it cannot be without action. So it doesn't help anyone if you kind of burst into tears at some of the stories that you hear, which are incredibly painful and difficult sometimes, and you can have empathy, but if it's not followed with action, then being a trustee is about action. It's about making a contribution, and that the role of being a volunteer, of listening and having compassion is one thing, but that's not the role of a trustee. So I think understanding what a trustee is compared to being a volunteer with your passion is quite different. I think you do need to understand the charity itself. You do need to go there and see it. I mean, I can't tell you the impact that, for instance, the charity I'm involved with, Welcome House, has, which supports asylum seekers and refugees in Hull and East Riding. When our funders come and see what we do, they absolutely get it. And it's the same for a trustee. You need to go. You need to have some engagement with the charity first and foremost before you decide that's the right charity that you want to support and you want to work with.
I know Harriet's keen to speak with you as well, and that action part I think is really important, but understanding the legal responsibilities around that action. So I think this is the best place to segue into my co-host, Harriet.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd just like to agree with you that understanding the charity, going to the charity and seeing what it does is really, really important before becoming a trustee. On today's cast, we've spoken to Gerry Morrison, who is the head of the charities team at Rollits, And she thought the key qualities and skills of a trustee are fully understanding their role and responsibilities, really understanding the charity's objects and ensuring that there isn't mission drift, and ensuring that you have the time commitment to act as a charity trustee. In your experience, what key qualities and skills make for an effective trustee, an effective chair, and how can trustees work best with the charity's leadership team?
Okay, well, I can only echo what Gerry said, because she's absolutely spot on. What I would say is that you have to understand what skills and abilities you have that you're bringing to the charity as well. I am not an accountant, so please don't ask me to be a treasurer. I mean, obviously, because of my career, I do understand finance, but you've got to think about what your skills are, what your expertise is that you can bring that can best help that charity. And that can also shape which charity you become involved with. So that's very important.
I think not being afraid to ask the question where you do feel like you're not as strong in a particular skill. So like you say, if you don't feel like accounts is your strength, then not being afraid to ask the question, speak to the advisors, speak to the people who prepared the accounts, and just remembering that no question is a silly question. I think sometimes, particularly new trustees, may find it quite daunting to sit on a board.
No, you're absolutely right, Harriet. And you're right. There is no such thing as a daft question, but that's also down to the ethos that the charity establishes. So, and that's really important aspect for the chair. So the chair should always try to make sure that everyone actually understands what's going on. And the executive can sometimes speak in acronyms, which is because it's their daily life. They're doing it all the time. If you're a trustee and you're turning up to a board meeting, which might be bi-monthly or quarterly or whatever frequency the meetings are, you won't have that intimate knowledge necessarily of exactly what's going on. So the chair's role is to make sure that everyone actually understands what's being talked about, and there is no daft question. You should always be curious. And I think we've had recent examples where charities have fallen foul of that, and trustees have simply not been curious enough to ask the right questions, or even to ask any questions. And I suppose I think the role of trustees has changed a lot. Not least through the good officers of the Charity Commission making sure that trustees understand their roles. But you can't just rock up having read the papers the week before and feel that you know everything about what that charity's doing. You have to become more involved than that, and you have to be curious. You have to ask questions, but supportively. You don't ask questions for the sake of being difficult. They've got to be purposeful questions. And my experience of the executive arms, if you like, of the charities with which I'm involved is that they really welcome that, because they want the board to kind of be the sounding board, the test bed really for, well, I've got this idea, what do you think about that? And that's where the skills and expertise that you have on that charity board are really important, because hopefully you've got a good balance there across all the different aspects, so you can bounce off one another really, and the executive should be able to use the board as a bit of a test bed and an opportunity to explore options.
Yeah, and like you say, the skills without the time commitment, it doesn't. You need to have both. And if trustees feel like they just don't have the time to commit to being a board member, then reminding them that they can be involved with the charity in another voluntary role, or being part of a committee. If it's just to oversee a particular project, then having those skills on a delegated committee board can be really useful for charities.
Yeah, absolutely. It's playing to your strengths, isn't it? It's thinking about what you can bring to that charity, and also not thinking you've got to do everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Brilliant. I feel like we've learned so much in the short time we've spoken to you, Trish, but I'm really, really keen to touch on, our intention is for our podcast to be launched during National Trustees Week, which is on the 4th of November, beginning the 4th of November 2024. How important is it that charities within our region look to promote and align their values with National Trustees Week?
Well, of course, it's very important. trustees are sometimes kind of the unseen part of a charity as well, which is right and proper, I have to say to you. You don't expect them to be lauded in the way that, you know, active volunteers and the people actually working in charities are. So I think it's important that trustees are recognised for the contribution that they make, but it also means that people can say, oh, I wonder what they do. It's that, you know, that potential to spark the interest of being a trustee for other people. Most boards do have difficulty in recruiting trustees, which is why I think the Trustee Academy is so important, because it gives people the opportunity to think about what the responsibilities of being a trustee are in a supportive atmosphere, so that they're not so daunted by it. But hopefully it will spark some people to think about what they could become involved with in their local communities.
Brilliant. And I think there's lots of advice within this conversation in regards to current trustees and future trustees as well. And you've been really fantastic in sharing your journey, being really honest about some of the challenges that you face as a trustee. I'm wondering if you can summarise your experience in 3 key pieces of advice for current charity trustees.
That's a hard one, Sophie. Be curious. Understand what you are bringing and value that. You know, that's really important, I think. And just remember the difference in the role of being a trustee to being part of the executive.
Brilliant. I think that's. I mean, the thing is, as I'm speaking now, I'm thinking of loads of others as well. But you wanted just 3, so I'll stop there.
I did, and maybe we can have a follow-up conversation with you,
yeah.
Trish, in series 2. So, Trish's advice, which I wholeheartedly agree with, is number 1, be curious, and I think we've talked about that curiosity often within this conversation. Number 2, understanding what you can bring and what value you can add to the organisation that you're passionate about. And third and finally, understanding the difference between the role of a trustee and an executive. And again, I think that's really important, especially around the governance of how charities operate. Before you leave, Trish, I know you're really, really keen to share with us kind of two bits of advice.
Okay. I think it goes back to why I've become involved in different charities. I live my life by 2 tenets, and they are, there but for the grace of God go I. You do not know what someone else's journey is, and you do not know why they need the help and support of any particular charity, and just remember that could be you. That's really important. And then the other, and they both sound very biblical, by the way, but and the other is, by their fruit shall you know them. So it's not about what people say they do, it's what people do, it's what their actions are, and it's how they treat other people. They treat people with respect and dignity. So they're the 2 sort of binding rules, really, of my life, I like to think, and I hope that I achieve them most of the time. But those 2 are really important, and that's another reason why I became involved in charities after I retired, because you don't know what's happened to someone in their lives, and that could be you, and you must never ever forget that.
I think that's an amazing ethos to end the episode on, Trish. And again, we've spoken about trustees today and the importance of trustees and what they can bring to charities, but we also know that one act of kindness can be done by anyone at any time as well. So whether you're a volunteer, whether you're a charity trustee, whether you've got somebody living down your street that just needs a little bit of help, maybe that initial act of kindness can lead to you becoming a volunteer and potential trustee in the future. So I think that's a fantastic way to finish our very first episode, and I'm sure that anybody who listens to this will be hugely inspired by everything that you've said here today. You've been an outstanding guest, our first ever podcast guest. Hugely appreciate your time, your insights, your experience, and I know that whoever listens to this podcast will gain a great deal from this conversation. Thank you, Trish. It's been a pleasure.
No, that's my pleasure. And if anyone sort of wants an individual conversation because I've said something or they think I'd like to explore that a little bit further, then they can just get in touch with me through the Hey Smile Foundation, and I'd be delighted to have a chat. And if anyone's thinking about becoming a trustee and wants kind of, to explore that in a little bit more detail, then just get in touch.
Wonderful. Well, I think you'll be inundated, Trish. So thank you so much for your time today. It's hugely appreciated.
No, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of the Hey Charity Podcast. We hope you found today's discussion as inspiring and insightful as we did. And remember, whether you're a charity leader, trustee or passionate supporter, there's always more to learn about how we can make a greater impact together. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review and share it with your network. Your support helps us continue to bring valuable insights to the charitable community.
And if you have any questions, suggestions or ideas for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. All contact details are in the episode description.
Until next time, keep making a difference and thank you for listening.
The legal discussion featured on the podcast is for general guidance only. It provides useful information in a concise form. Action should not be taken without obtaining specific legal advice.